at the seminary. Therefore, pipe organ was a major focus of his years at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. He would practice 3 hours per day, 6 to 7 days per week. He also played for chapel services, sharing his duty with other seminarians who were in the rotation. He was often an organ soloist at the seminary chorus concerts given throughout the year and in congregations as they toured. At the seminary, his talents were put to use. Professor Oswald, who was the music man here at Northwestern College, was also the music man at the seminary in Queensville. And what he did was he commuted weekly via the interurban from Watertown to Milwaukee, then up to the Queensville stop. So during his years at the seminary, Professor Oswald knew what he had in Bruce Backer. Professor Backer sang in the seminary chorus. In his senior year after his victory, he was appointed to be assistant director of the chorus to assist Professor Oswald. Professor Backer remembers during this year singing a portion of the Bach cantata, "Ah, how fleeting, ah, how nothing is man's life." I would have said it in German instead. You wouldn't want to hear that. As has been mentioned, after receiving his degree from JLC, Professor Backer, with the encouragement of his father, began summer organ lessons at the University of Minnesota and was encouraged to come back. However, Dr. Ewald Nolte, the brother of friend Waldemar Nolte, and Professor Waldemar Nolte later was a co-worker on the JLC music faculty, was teaching at Northwestern University in Evanston at the time, and encouraged Professor Backer to submit a tape and to write a theme at Northwestern University. And so what began at Northwestern University in the summer of 1953 continued for a total of 4 summers. Professor Backer often had 3 organ lessons a week during the summer, with resulting practice and preparation at a time when he described his music reading ability as minimal. His teacher at Northwestern University was Thomas Matthews, perhaps best known as the teacher of voice, sopranos, used in the services of the Episcopalian Church. Professor Backer received his summer lessons on a Skinner organ at St. Luke's Episcopalian Church in Evanston, and it was also during this time that he first met Dr. Heinrich Fleischer, beginning 40 years of protracted organ study with Dr. Fleischer. And it came about in this way. His father, Professor Emil Backer, had been invited to attend a meeting of musicians at the request of Concordia Publishing House. And Dr. Fleischer was also present at that meeting. And Professor Emil Backer was immediately drawn to Dr. Fleischer because Professor Emil Backer loved Bach, and Dr. Heinrich Fleischer was a walking encyclopedia of all things Bach. So in Professor Backer's words, "My father asked Heinrich if his derelict son could take lessons from him." And the rest of the story is now musical history. Professor Backer still describes with amusement taking the organ lessons from Dr. Fleischer. He would travel to the Chicago Musical College, which was located at 64 West Van Buren in the Chicago Loop, take a derelict elevator up to the 6th floor of the building, and come to a room lit with only one light bulb, and located inside of which was a theater organ. Visibility in the room was made even more difficult by Dr. Fleischer smoking throughout the entire lesson. However, on this theater organ, Dr. Fleischer was always able to find the necessary sounds to teach his student the work of Bach, Buxtehude, and Reger. Professor Backer received lessons from Dr. Fleischer from 1951 to 1953 before starting his lessons at Northwestern University. And following his graduation from Northwestern University, he resumed lessons with Dr. Fleischer during the summers of 1957 and 1958. For lessons then, Dr. Fleischer used the 4-manual Skinner organ located in the Rockefeller Chapel on the midway of the University of Chicago. If you've ever been to the midway of Chicago and driven down that rather ornate landscape site right there, the chapel is a huge building. Professor Backer shared the challenge of playing in an organ console that was located about a block away from the pipework. The delay between pressing the key and hearing the sound made for interesting organ player. Shortly after his arrival on the campus of UNLC, beginning in 1959, Professor Backer began his studies at the University of Minnesota, where he completed all the necessary coursework and the preliminary examination for a PhD in musicology with a minor in German literature. And at the University of Minnesota, he was able in the mid to late 1960s to resume his organ lessons with Dr. Fleischer, who moved from Northwestern University to the University of Minnesota. Lessons were held at the Grace Lutheran University Church and later at the First Unitarian Society. All told, Professor Backer had 40 years of lessons with Dr. Fleischer. And not only did a musical relationship develop, but also a very congenial personal relationship between the two men. The influence of Dr. Fleischer on Professor Backer and then on the organ performance of innumerable organists in the Wells can't really fully be calculated. As professor of organ at Dr. Martin Luther College, Professor Backer knew which of his organ students were capable of going on and doing graduate work, and a number of them continued their organ studies at the University of Minnesota under the teaching of Dr. Fleischer. You're hearing some of them today. Mrs. Bell, Ms. Brayman. The influence of Dr. Fleischer in their music playing comes not only from what he taught them, but also from the foundation laid by Professor Backer in the organ studios at UNLC. Consider this generational aspect. Professor Backer taught Mrs. Adele. Mrs. Adele taught Ms. Brayman. Ms. Brayman taught Mr. Smith. 4 generations. Okay. Mrs. Miller served as an emergency organ instructor at the UNLC for 3 semesters. Her department chair was Professor Chris Backer. Mrs. Miller has taught numerous organ students over the year with the influence of Professor Backer simply hovering over her. Consider Professor Bode, his first choral conducting class. The choral conducting class of Professor Backer. What a legend. We're going to look right now at Professor Backer as a writer of hymns. In the 1980s, Solomon Wells' playing and new hymnal, the final product is Christian Worship, which you have in the pews in front of you, published in 1990. Professor Backer was a member of the Joint Hymnal Committee and was assigned to the committee dealing with hymns. He told me this came as a surprise to him, but the results are noteworthy because of new melodies and settings completed by Professor Backer and used in the hymnal. The committee asked Professor Backer to craft several new melodies for hymn texts already in use. These were hymn texts that were paired with existing melodies that the committee found perhaps to be too simple or at times too difficult. Professor Backer was asked to write hymn melodies that supported but did not distract from the text, and the melodies also needed to be playable. The first hymn melody we're going to look at this afternoon is Christian Worship 81. If you open up your hymnals, please. The melody is entitled Epiphany and was written in 1989 to be used with this hymn text. The setting that we're going to be hearing in the hymnal is Professor Backer's. Professor Bode of LPS is going to play the Christian Worship setting and also the intonation created by Professor Backer. Following the intonation, we invite you to join in the first stanza of the hymn. longtime editor of the Wells publication, The Northwestern Lutheran. And he asked that a melody be written for the hymn text that he had written triumphant from the grave. Professor Backer relates that he composed this melody while walking from his house to the DMLC campus. This crowd took him up the Center Street Hill and then the Excelsior steps to Old Main. And if you've ever walked that route, you know that's a good cardiac workout. When he arrived at his office, he sat down and put the melody to paper. We'll hear the intonation on the hymn, followed by the Christian worship setting, which is in our hymnal written by Professor James Engel, a colleague of Professor Backer on the DMLC music faculty. This melody is used twice in Christian worship. First, in 187, and then also again in 553. This was one of the melodies that was requested by the Joint Hymnal Committee for the text of hymn 157, When God the Spirit Came. The name Franklin comes from the street where the Backers lived in Rome. 110 North Franklin Street in Rome, Minnesota, 56073. We hear the setting and join us please then also. worship handbook, Professor Backer also contributed 10 other hymn settings that are used in the hymnal, as well as developing the hymn